Well, when Joel was little, not too little, we got an 8mm camera. Joel was always fascinated with that thing. And then we got an 8mm projector. And then he took off like a steam engine.
I started showing films in my garage when I was a kid. I turned my parents' basement into a movie theater.
And I made popcorn, and Joel went to the library and rented these films and set it all up in the garage, and we put sheets over the junk, fixed it all up like a movie theater.
I would hand draw flyers. There was no way to print them, so I would redraw them over and over again and hand those out to everyone in the neighborhood.
And I think it was quite a lot of fun. Kids sat there spellbound because this was before everybody had a television. So it was kind of fun to go over to the neighbors and watch movies.
Then when I moved to Lawrence, I had already collected a lot of films in Wichita when I came up here, because that was actually the tail end of when everybody was throwing them away. So I wanted to do a drive-in theme party because I'd worked at a lot of drive-ins. I managed a drive-in in Emporia, and I kind of wanted to bring back a drive-in. A friend of ours had a huge backyard in Vinland, so he said, come on out here and we'll do it out here. So we did a whole series of the Escape drive-ins.
I'd heard about them. They were legendary, where out in the country, Joel would set up a big screen and do pretty much what you're doing with Basement Sublet of Horror, I think, with intersplicing of old archived footage in a comic way. And I'd never seen that. I'd known people who had gone to your shows or had seen your shows in Wichita, heard over and over how good you were at it and how entertaining they were. So I was pleased that was part of the Basement Sublet of Horror as well, as opposed to just the typical horror host.
Shows got out of hand. I mean, we'd have 200 to 300 people showing up, and it was really just myself and my wife and a couple other people doing all the work, and it just was too much for everybody to deal with. So I looked for another way to show films, and the Free State Brewery had just opened their beer garden, which was supposed to be a third movie theater for Liberty Hall. So it had the projection booth and everything, but it was just an empty shell. So I changed the name to the Empty Pockets Budget Film Fest as the indoor version of the movie show, and Empty Pockets ran at the Free State Brewery for 3 years. The Wichita Center for the Arts picked it up and as a summer replacement show, and it just wound up staying on and playing for 6 years down there. And the indoor version adopted a lot of the Escape drive-in elements, live music, prize drawing, along with a few new ones of interactive games. The trouble with that show was I did it too long, too many shows, and really just got burned out on it. I'd have to drive down to Wichita and load in the gear, and essentially I had some help, but it was essentially just me doing this whole thing again.
Our grand prize, the big can of pork and beans.
The next logical step was a TV show. In the genre of horror hosts, there are just a few characters that are worked with. So I just kind of see it as a form of theater in a way that has the archetype character that you play. There's the ghoul, there's the mad scientist, and I don't know, is there a third one? Usually they're ghouls and mad scientists. I went with the ghoul because that was what the host was. The host in Rodney, the host was actually Tom Leahy. He played the host and also played a science fiction host, a cartoon host in the afternoons called Major Astro. And Major Astro was on forever, and I would watch Major Astro, but I'd also watch the host and Rodney. So in the afternoons I had Major Astro, and late at night we had the host and Rodney, and it just was a really great thing because Tom is really energetic and flamboyant and really goes over the top with the whole deal, and so he was always entertaining as the host. Kind of playing homage to the host and Rodney, but I'm also kind of doing a parody of the host and Rodney. I love the show. I've always loved the show, but just like I mess with the films, I have to mess with the format. The name Gunther Deadman came from a dream I had probably, I think, about 1983. The first appearance of Gunther Deadman is in a book of short stories that I wrote. But in the dream, I was watching a TV show, and it was called Gunther Deadman's Floating Spaceship. And from that point on, I just stuck in the back of my mind that I wanted to do a TV show with at least one of the characters being Gunther Deadman. In the 60s, Dick Smith, the famous makeup artist, put a magazine together for kids, the Famous Monsters of Filmland Makeup Handbook. And it showed you how to do a whole range of makeups from just ordinary household stuff. So Gunther Deadman is a takeoff on the ghoul. So the makeup is pretty much traditional ghoul makeup. I just sat down, made it up on the first show, and I put on heavier eyebrows. That just comes from Groucho Marx, because that's one of the things I read about him, is why he had those big eyebrows. It made his face more expressive. You know, big eyebrows, you can raise and lower them. And I'm also trying with the makeup, I didn't want to really be a celebrity, so what I'm doing is I tried to create a character that doesn't look like me, so that when I go out, I don't really want to be stopped as Gunther Deadman. I don't want people coming up to me.
Hello, my friends.
The worse my hair was in real life, the better it looked on the show, you know, so the more straggly it was, the better. So the very, very first show, I watched that again, and it's awfully short. I mean, I thought it was long at the time, but it looked much better towards the end of the season when it's really, really straggly. And Gunther Deadman's voice was, you know, just supposed to be this old man voice. And I tried it on camera, and it just didn't work. And I know Gunther's a German name, so several people who said, why doesn't he have a German accent? Well, it just didn't make sense, and I felt silly doing a German accent. So I wasn't really trying to do an English accent. That's just what came out. That's the voice that I tried several voices on camera, and that's the first one that I felt comfortable using.
Action. Yeah.
Action. Hello, my friends, and tonight... I wanted to have an elaborate opening title sequence, but once you get into digital compositing and putting things together, it really just takes a huge amount of time to process that video. So the opening of the show is actually a parody of the horror host show from Wichita, the host and Rodney. One of the later versions of the show, there was this old haunted house on the hilltop, and the camera would pull in slowly, and there'd be a light on in the window, like a dungeon window, and the camera would go to that window, and then it would crossfade to the set, which is the set of a dungeon. So since I grew up in ranch-style homes, and I now live in a ranch-style home, it struck me as funny to have the whole show take place in a ranch home. You know, I like the humor of that. And it's the same thing where the camera zooms into a basement window, and it's the same idea. The opening title music is nothing high-tech, you know, just a collected feel from a lot of different films. So the Don Knotts films and the Addams Family, all of that's all kind of mixed together, not really consciously. I just took it all in and made my own version of that, because I wanted to have the same feel as a 60s or 70s horror TV show. I decided there's one thing lacking from the opening music, and that was a theremin, and didn't have access to a theremin. So that's where David Bagsby's credit comes in as keyboard consultant, is that he said, well, why don't you just use an analog synthesizer? Dragged out one of my old analog synths, and just, you know, a couple minutes I had a theremin, and just played the whole, you know, theremin bit separate from the soundtrack, and then just merged them together in the video. Good evening. There we go. God dang, cameraman. Never here when you need 'em. Good evening. I am your host, Gunther Deadman. It takes a lot of people to do a TV show, so what I try to do is sit down and find the way to make a show with absolutely nothing. No money, no help or anything. Mainly because I wasn't sure it would work. So the first 6 shows, I shot them all myself. I would set up the camera. the camera has a little monitor. I'd turn the monitor around so I could see it, and I would actually be running everything, running the audio and all that. So if you see the first episode, you'll actually see me wearing headphones, which is a glitch, a flaw, because I was supposed to take them off. So, you know, when you see me with headphones on in the early shows, that's because I just would space out and leave them on. But it really didn't matter anyway, because I don't know if people even noticed or even cared that. So I just left all the flaws in. There aren't any scripts for the show. Somebody asked me, like, you know, who writes the scripts, and there are no scripts. All I do is I make a list of the topics that the film was talking about when a break occurs, and then I just make up something on the spot, and it's more of a check sheet for me to make sure I get enough shots for the show. David Nichol, who's a neighbor of mine, volunteered to run the camera, and that made a big difference because I really had a tough time shooting the host segments, and it turned out the reason why is that with David Nichol there, I had immediate feedback. I would know if it was funny, something was funny or not. I could try a bit again, and I don't know, was that any good?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
You have a general idea of what you want to do for each segment. At the same time, it's pretty much just turning the camera on and seeing what you get. And that's the beauty of it. It's just been a learning experience for me for the most part, and fun.
The editing style of the show is actually a style I came up with when I was doing the Escape Drive-In. I bought these bad horror films, but the trouble with the bad horror film is that very few people can sit through the whole thing or want to sit through the whole thing. So what I started doing was condensing them down to a half an hour and then intercutting them with other just unrelated material. These cutaways serve two purposes. One is for humor. The other is to distract people from the gaping plot holes that I've created by cutting the film down to nothing. That style is kind of adopted and been expanded on with the Basement Sublet. The main differences being with digital editing, now I can do a lot of effects. I can clean it up. You don't hear all the tape splices that used to be in the Escape Drive-In films. It's just a little bit slicker.
If he's wearing the wrong type of clothing, this would be a violation of the mores of his culture. Not only would he shock other members of his society and cause great disturbance, but his society might also take official action to stop him from this violation of its mores.
The reason for an hour is actually because most of the empty pockets in Escape films were on 50-minute reels. So I'm still working with that 50-minute format. A normal hour of television is only 40 minutes, 35 minutes, with the rest of it all commercials. So there are no commercial breaks, so I needed an excuse to break away for the host to come back in. Actually, the public access breaks are actually my own separate little art project to add in photographs that are a bit askew or off-key. So they're civic shots of the city buildings, you know, but then there are also other things like that they would never show, like, you know, street construction, you know, and that's just stuff that I enjoy taking pictures of. The other thing I wanted to have in the show were more characters, you know, protagonists, you know, to Gunther Deadman, something that would irritate him or drive him crazy. Gunther Deadman is this guy sitting in the basement, you know, doing these shows, broadcasting them on his own. So I really wanted to have a neighbor come in, and the neighbor would just come in, they would just be an ordinary person, and he would shatter this reality, because you'd have this guy with all this makeup on and this guy, you know, everyday guy sitting next to him going like, hey, what are you doing? I was lucky enough to have some great publicity for the show. Ann Tangman, who is a writer for the Lawrenceian, Ann called me one day and said, well, it's going to be on the cover of the Lawrenceian. Through that, the Journal World did an article on the show. the interesting thing about that is all the photos in those articles, both articles, I shot all the photos for that, so that was kind of fun to be an amateur photographer and, you know, sneak some more of my work into the media. But a weird thing happened from the Journal World article. A scout for HGTV's show, Offbeat America, was scanning the internet for unusual dwellings or unusual houses or whatever, and she found the photo of me as Gunther Dedman in this apartment. And they thought it was real, so they called me up and they asked, actually the phone rang and this woman said, "Is Gunther there?" And I said, I thought someone was messing with me, and I said, "Yes, this is Gunther." And she said, "Gunther, we'd like to talk to you about being on HGV's show." And I was like, what? So I let her go on for a while because I thought it was a put on, and it wasn't. They were actually talking to me about being on the show. And I said, "Do you realize this is fiction, right? This doesn't exist. There isn't an apartment. It's just part of my basement." There's a long pause, and she's like, "Oh." It actually made it to the meeting where they decide what's going to be on the show. But I guess compared to the other things they had, this wasn't interesting enough. So I got a rejection phone message.
Hi, Joel. He just wanted to let you know that at this time, your home was not selected to be on the program.
I think the charm in Gunther is that he's, for the most part, unscripted, very spontaneous. You never quite know what he's going to do, which is part of the fun.
I'm much more comfortable as Gunther Dedman in front of the camera. Much more comfortable because that's the character I can step into, and it's not me, and it's much easier to do.
Good night, my friends.